3, 4.
Instant karma is the result of all of our actions. Every action that we make has a consequence. What we put out to others comes back to us, and this is called the ripple effect. We stand for a positive reflection of self and others. We give respect, we honor traditions and cultures, and we share that knowledge. What we as humanity do as one is up to us, and it's time to make that choice. In an era where truth is buried like a lost treasure and history is being rewritten, we believe now is that time to correct this. See, truth is like the sun, and eventually that light comes out. And here on Instant Karma, we feel it is our purpose that we all shine on together as one.
Thank you for joining Instant Karma Show. I'm your host, Valerie Clark. Today's guest is archaeologist Dr. Jeffrey Baker. Jeff Baker grew up in northern Ohio and earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Akron. While a student, he worked on his first archaeological projects, an excavation at the childhood home of Harvey Firestone, a survey along the Cuyahoga River, and excavations at the site of Poverty Point in Louisiana. After completing his undergraduate studies, he enrolled in the graduate program in anthropology at the University of Arizona. There, under the tutelage of Pat Colbert, he began to study the prehistoric Maya. Dr. Baker did not restrict his studies to the field of anthropology, but also spent time studying tropical ecology, including spending a summer in Costa Rica participating in a course taught by the Organization for Tropical Studies at Universidad de Costa Rica. Although his primary research interest was on the Maya and strongly influenced by the late Robert Netting, a professor at the University of Arizona, Dr. Baker participated in a number of cultural research management projects throughout the U.S. Southwest. Following his completion of his dissertation, the vagaries of the academic job market led Dr. Baker to take employment in the CRM field working in the southwestern U.S. He has directed excavations at a variety of sites, including Tucson, Phoenix, and the Prescott areas. Most recently, he has moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, and conducts archaeological work in the Great Basin for HRA Incorporated Conservation Archaeology. During his spare time, Dr. Baker plays darts and caters to the needs of his dog, Ruby. Thank you for joining me, Jeff. The very first question that I really want to ask you is you use the word Maya without an N versus Mayan with an N. Why is this?
So it comes down to linguistic practices for words for certain people like Maya, Inca, Navajo, Hopi, like that there are rules that dictate when you use plural and singular R, and for those rules, the plural singular possessive for Maya is Maya. And so that has spread into the archaeological community, and so we generally use Maya because of these linguistic rules, rather than a lot of the mainstream press uses Mayan. So it's sort of working under different linguistic rules, I guess.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. What would it have been like to live as a Maya in approximately 700 AD?
Well, 700 AD, the Maya lowland, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And like say you go down there and you see forests everywhere. Most of the forest is cut down. It's fairly sizable cities, but probably 80% of the population lived in rural areas and were farmers, be doing farm labor most of their day, possibly coming in once a week or so to a market to sell their crops and possibly pick up things that other people were making, whether it be clothing or pottery or other types of things they needed. Work had a very high infant mortality, and most, probably over 50%. But once it got past about the age of 4 or 5, most people probably lived in their 50s or 60s without too much trouble.
Oh, wow.
The way it was in most of the world prior to the beginning of the 19th century, where everyone had just very high mortality, but then if you survive basically your infant years, got into, somewhere 5 to 10 years old, you lived a fairly long life. Mm-hmm. I mean, they did have problems, obviously, they didn't have the healthcare system we have nowadays, so that people would, diseases that today we wouldn't think twice about could easily kill people back then. But, it definitely was not an easy life. You would have had to walk everywhere, obviously. They had no horses or cows. The largest domesticated animal they had would have been the dog. And so everything was either walk everywhere and move stuff around, people would carry it on their back. There definitely would have been clear separation between the elites and the commoners. Probably about 10% of the population probably was elites, and they would have had privileges that weren't available to commoners. These would have been things written into the law, like maybe, when the Spaniards arrived in 1500, the nobles were allowed to wear cotton clothing, but the commoners had to wear clothing made from agave, which is much scratchier, not as fine of material for making clothing out of. And there would have been other things that nobles would have been allowed to do that would have been barred to the commoners.
What foods would they have eaten, and what have you discovered the early Maya people to have cultivated?
The main items they ate were maize, beans, and squash, but beyond that, they also cultivated manioc, chili pepper, chaya. It's sort of a leafy green vegetable, kind of like spinach, but it grows on a shrub. They also had chayote, which is another type of squash, hackberry, mamey fruit, figs from fig trees, variety of palms like the quail palm. Also would have eaten passion fruit and nance, and avocado, sapodilla. They also, in addition to things they grew for food, they also would have grown cotton and tobacco, probably and agave as well.
What about for meat sources? Did they have any meat sources?
They did eat turkey and deer and probably dog as well. And in a few places close to the coast, they would have had access to marine foods, and some of those marine foods were traded inland to the elites. So that, if you were living like Tikal and you were noble, you would on a regular basis get food brought in from the coast, seafood brought in from the coast. But if you were a commoner, you probably never had any seafood at all during your life. And I'm sure for a lot of people, eating meat was not something they did every day. It would have been something, maybe once a week or once every couple weeks you might get some meat in your diet.
I know you and I discussed one time how people tend to get the Maya and the Aztec confused because of their religious practices.
Yeah, they sort of share a lot of similarities, but there also are a lot of differences in what they did. From the evidence that we have, the Aztecs did a lot more human sacrifices, and you see a lot of times someone a priest ripping the heart out of somebody. That was an Aztec practice. We have no evidence that took place among the Maya. And in some cases, like rituals for rain, the Maya would sacrifice a dog, while the Aztecs would actually sacrifice a slave, basically a human being. Mm-hmm. So there were some differences in those veins.
Let me ask you this. This is a big debate in archaeology. Do you agree with others in your field who specialize with the pre-Hispanic Maya that the civilization's decline had to do with drought, that basically they thirst to death?
No. I have a number of problems with the argument that drought caused the decline of the Maya. The drought, based upon the evidence we have now, the drought, at least when it starts getting bad, and I'm not even sure, I'll get to this in a minute, but I'm not even sure if drought is the right word for what was going on, but basically when we start seeing the rainfall decline, it doesn't start declining until after 800 AD, and based upon the evidence we have on population, it looks like 10 in the area around Tikal, and also Tlacmol, which is another major Maya site located in Mexico. It looks like their population began to decline around 760 or so AD, so about 30 to 40 years before we start seeing this evidence for a decline in rainfall. Another issue is that the decline in population didn't occur all at one time, and it looks like right now that the decline in population occurred first in the wetter areas and then slowly moved to the drier areas, and some of the areas, like the northern part of the Yucatan, which is particularly dry, actually had fairly substantial population growth when the evidence we have indicates there was a drying period going on. And so you'd think if the drought was causing this problem, they would not be moving into the driest portions of the Yucatan Peninsula, but moving into the wettest portions.
Okay, got you.
And another thing to consider, too, is for southern lowlands, the area getting around Tikal and Tlacmol and where Flores is today, the rainfall is fairly high. You get from 1,000 to 1,200 millimeters of rain a year. So even if you have a 20% decline in rainfall, you're still talking about 800 millimeters a year, which is more than enough for maize-based agriculture. So, seeing that there was a decline in rainfall doesn't necessarily indicate they had a drought going on or that it was having as big a problem as some people talk about. And I think one of the reasons why archaeologists seem to focus on lack of rainfall so much is when we go down to work in the area, we go down during the dry season. And so we show up, usually the dry season runs from around January to the beginning of January to the end of April, more or less. The exact time, varies from year to year, but we show up like in January or February after the dry season has already started so that we don't have as much problem with rainfall when we're doing our excavations. And some of the places fairly remote, we're relying upon natural water sources and what's already there. And so there are a number of projects that have major problems with water availability because they just go down there for those 3 or 4 months, and someone who's living down there has the entire year to build up a supply of water to get them through those 3 or 4 months. And those things point out, people sometimes refer to as being a seasonal desert, that, it's like a desert during the dry season. But the amount of rainfall you get during the dry season alone, during those 4 months dry season, is actually twice as much rainfall as you get in places like Tucson or Phoenix or Las Vegas. So, yeah, it's much drier than it is during the rainy season, but they still get some water there, and the water limitations are nowhere near as bad for someone who lives down there year-round and has time to build up a store of water that's just showing up in January or February and then leaving before the rain starts. So that, I think, gives the archaeologists that are working there sort of a biased perspective on the water issue down there.
Okay. Well, what about modern farmers in the Maya area? Do they utilize the landscape in a similar fashion to the ancient Maya, or do they face the similar problems that the Maya faced?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Population density is substantially lower today than it was in like 700 AD. So some of the things that some of the practices that the Maya used during the Classic period, they don't use today. They had terraced hillsides. They converted some of their swamps into raised fields. So basically, it would take an area that was too wet for agriculture and build these platforms up in the middle of the wetland, and then they'd have basically like a dry plot of land in the wetland they could grow crops on. So, and these are things that modern farmers don't do because they don't need to do it. They can avoid some of the steeper areas, and they can avoid areas that are too wet. But on the other hand, there are some similarities, though, in that for both the pre-Hispanic Maya and the modern Maya, they use a variety of different ecological zones. Modern farmers will use some of the seasonal wetlands. When the water recedes at the end of the rainy season, they'll plant a crop on the edges of the wetland where the water is receding, take it right back, but then they'll let that grow and mature during the dry season. Then they'll also plant another crop in upland areas. Basically, these are areas that aren't flooded. Some of the differences between like upland and wetland can be on the order of 10 feet. So it's not huge, but that's different enough to keep it from being flooded for years. Okay. And we see the same thing going on in the past where, the pre-Hispanic Maya use a variety of different ecological zones. They use both wetlands and well-drained upland areas. But what they did do is they expanded to a much wider variety of wetlands and into slightly steeper terrain that the modern Maya don't use. And in the past, particularly like the end of the pre-classic from lake cores, there looks like there was a huge episode of erosion going on. And from pre-classic Maya, which is basically 200 BC to AD 200, we find very little evidence for terracing. There are a few terraces constructed then, but nowhere near as many as you see constructed in the late classic around 600 to 700 AD. And at that time period, it looks like the erosion in 600 to 700 AD was substantially lower than it was around 200 BC. And part of that is because of all the terraces they were building. It's possible that as population grows in the modern area, the farmers could face similar problems with erosion. They are having to deal with water shortages in some areas, particularly because water is being, cities down there, within the northern Yucatan are larger than they have been in the past. I mean, what modern farmer has advantages the ancient farmer didn't have. They have pesticides, they have fertilizers that weren't available to the pre-Hispanic Maya. And one of the biggest problems a farmer would have faced in the pre-Hispanic era was food storage, because they didn't have any way of keeping insects or rats away or mold off of their stored food. They could smoke the food, which would help preserve it for a longer period of time than just putting it in raw, but they didn't have like the refrigeration technology we have and some of the pesticides and other things we use to protect our crops and storage.
Right. So if anyone is interested in being an archaeologist, what would you recommend them to do, and how would they go into this field?
You'd have to go to college and get a degree generally you get a degree in anthropology. Archaeology, at least in the U.S., is a subfield of anthropology. And most archaeologists in the U.S. these days work in cultural resource management, which basically is you're working for private companies, helping people stay in compliance with federal and state laws that require archaeological work. The projects that are on state land or involve state or federal land or involve state or federal money. And generally to get into that, these days you need at least a bachelor's degree before you get hired. And if you want to be a supervisory position, you have to go on to master's degree. But the one thing I would suggest to people, though, is to get the bachelor's degree and then work for a couple years doing field work. And there are a variety of places where you can look have places for jobs for archaeologists. There's an email list called Shovel Bombs. There's the webpage archaeologyfieldwork.com that has things. And so those are places where once you get the bachelor's degree, start looking for work. Again, while you're going to school, you should try to get involved in a field school. That is something that will help you get a job later when you get out, is you've got a chance to participate in archaeological excavation while you're in school and do some of the other lab analysis and things that go along with it.
Would you advise any specific field that right now is very popular in archaeology?
Well, generally the most popular fields are the hardest ones to find. The ones that are most popular to people are the ones that are hardest to find a job in after you get out. Like Maya archaeology has always been very popular, but then when you start applying for jobs and if you're doing Maya archaeology, the only paid position you can find is as a professor at a university, and those you'll get 400 applicants for a single position.
Oh, wow.
So it's extremely difficult to get into that. In North America, said with the CRM field, it's easier to get into it. There's a lot more people employed in it, and that it just depends on what you're interested in and where you want to live and where you want to work. Now, if you're living in Florida, it's probably much easier to get involved in work in the Southeast than it would be get involved in work like in the Western U.S.
No.
And vice versa.
Okay. Well, Jeff, it has been a pleasure having you on. I appreciate you being on Instant Karma Show with me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
That was archaeologist Dr. Jeffrey Baker. This is Instant Karma Show. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Valerie Clark, wishing you light and love.